Hi guys, great to have you here today. Today we're going to be talking about bounce, and we're not only going to talk about what bounce is on wedges, we're also going to talk about what type of bounce is best for you. So how many of you out there are laying the sod over the ball? You chunk the ball. I mean, that is the worst feeling in the world. You get up by the green, you're sitting there, maybe you got right by the green on a par 5 and 2, you're chipping for eagle, you're really excited, and then you chunk the ball and it rolls 3 feet. Well, that has a lot to do with technique, but it also has a lot to do with the bounce on the club. Maybe you're playing with a wedge that doesn't have enough bounce for you. So let's go ahead and get started. I'll tell you all about bounce, and that'll really help your guys' game. All right, so first let's go ahead and talk about the number of bounce and what that means. So here we have a side-on view of a wedge, and we can see that the leading edge, the part that would be cutting into the turf, right here at the front of this wedge, is a little bit off the ground if the club shaft is setting normal in a vertical angle. So the part that's touching the ground is back here, well behind the leading edge. This is probably about a 10-degree bounce wedge. So what this means and how you can envision this is, let's imagine that the ground here isn't solid turf, it's actually water. And when we hit a shot, what we want to do is we want the leading edge to be slightly off the ground, just a very small amount, and we want the back edge here behind the leading edge to be contacting the water and then sliding through the water. It kind of works like a rudder. If your leading edge starts to dig down into the water, you're going to chunk the ball. So if you have trouble chunking the ball, you really want to go to a higher bounce wedge, and that's going to help you to keep from chunking the ball, because even if you kind of slice down into the ground, even if you come in a little too steep, maybe you hit a ½ inch behind the ball, this back edge is going to catch and it's going to let the club glide right through there. Also, if you're hitting out of a bunker, it's going to help your club slide through the sand and come back up rather than digging down into the sand, which is the number one mistake I see with bunker shots. In the picture on the right, we have a wedge. Nobody would actually design a wedge this way. I've seen a couple of them actually from the early 1900s, late 1800s, where they actually had this kind of wedge where there's no bounce at all. And this thing's like a knife. I mean, it'll dart right into the ground. It's a chunking machine. I mean, you can't hardly stop from chunking the ball when you're using this kind of wedge, because you can see the leading edge is actually touching the ground. So again, imagine that that's water. And if I come down and contact that water, now it's all going to catch right up on the face of the club, and that club is just going to dart right down into the water. It's going to be a lot of trouble. Same thing happens in the grass. It's really easy to chunk the less bounce that you have. Now, the obvious disadvantage here is that the leading edge is now a little higher up off the ground, and if we come in a little thin, we could hit the ball thin and maybe scull it across the green, that kind of thing, which obviously we don't want to do. But to be honest, I don't see people that struggle with that. What I see people that struggle with chunking the ball, and as a result of chunking, they get a fear of hitting the turf, and then they come up and hit the ball thin. If you use a wedge that has a lot of bounce, now I can eliminate that fear of hitting the ground, because when I do hit the ground a few times, it just slides right on through. All right, so now let's go ahead and talk about what type of player you are and what type of bounce you could use on your wedges. There's different bounces depending on the type of wedge that you're going to use. First, we can go over the sand wedge, which would be your 56-degree wedge. And we'll go over a few different conditions and the type of player that you are. If you're in really wet conditions, maybe you're up in the north, in the United States where it's wet most of the year, you get a lot of rain. Maybe you're in Florida where it rains a ton and the conditions are sandy and the ground is very soft. So basically, if the ground is soft, we want to use some of the higher bounce options available. And I know that it's not always going to be soft outside. Sometimes it's going to be dry, sometimes it's going to be soft. You just got to pick one that's going to fit you the best and that matches most of your conditions. If 90% of the time it's wet, we're going to go with a high bounce club with your 56. So 12 to 16 degrees of bounce. Normal conditions, this would just be kind of average. It's not really wet where you live or where you dry, very dry where you live. It's kind of in the middle. 10 to 14 might be a good option for you there. And if it's really dry, maybe you're in Texas, maybe you're somewhere where the ground is this hard pan, really, dry ground, that 8 to 12 degree bounce for your sand wedge will be about right. If you tend to chunk the ball, this is the biggest advantage that bounce can have for you. If you tend to chunk, that leading edge touches the ground, it slices down into the turf, and you chunk the ball, you're going to want as much bounce as possible. So your 12 to 16 degrees is really going to help those of you that come in steep into the ball. If you're in Bermuda grass that tends to grab the club head, if that leading edge touches Bermuda and it's into the grain, it just knifes down into it. So the more bounce, the better there. If you're in really tight grass, you can go with a little bit lower. I'd use like a mid bounce, 10 to 14. So if you play somewhere up north where there's bent grass and it's really tightly mown, maybe it's only a 1/4 inch thick, you might go with a little bit less bounce. Hard pan, again, that's going to be that low bounce, the 8 to 12 degrees for the 56. And if you pick the ball, if you never really touch the ground, you're going to want that lower bounce. That way the leading edge is as close to the bottom of the club as possible. If you always pick the ball, you might want to work on, coming down and through, which is going to make it a lot more consistent. But, I'm just talking about fitting a wedge to your current game. So that's what I'd recommend for a sand wedge. A lob wedge is a little bit different because of the loft on the club. We want to get a little bit tighter under the ball, so the bounces are going to be a little bit less as you're going with a lob wedge. Again, wet grass, that's going to be your high bounce, 8 to 12 degrees on a lob wedge. Normal is 6 to 8, and then dry hard pan. Imagine hard pan Texas ground, 2 to 6 might be good. If you chunk the ball, again, you're going to want to go high bounce. High for a lob wedge is 8 to 12 degrees. If you're in that Bermuda and it's easy to catch that leading edge into the grass, high bounce again, 8 to 12 is great. Tight bent grass, a little bit of a tighter lie, that 6 to 8, which is kind of your mid-range for a lob wedge, a 60-degree wedge. Hard pan, tight, super, super tight lies that you get on hard pan, you're going to want to go a little lower bounce, 2 to 6. And if you pick the ball clean again, you don't really hit much ground at all, you're going to want to go with the lower bounce, which would be 2 to 6 also. Those are my recommendations. Everybody is going to fit into all these categories at some time or not. If it rains the day before and it's super wet, it doesn't mean you're going to go out and change your wedge. It just means if 90% of the time that I play, the conditions are one way, then I'm going to pick a wedge that fits that pretty well. If I tend to chunk, I'm going to pick a wedge that's higher bounce, and you just kind of pick one that's good for you. And the last thing I'll talk about is a very big misconception out there with hitting lob shots. People think that when I open the wedge up, I need to get rid of all the bounce so I can hit a flop shot. Well, Phil Mickelson, probably one of the most famous flop shot hitters in the history of the game, his 60-degree wedge has, I think, 10 degrees of bounce on it. I know he played with a 10-degree bounce at one time. He may have even used a 12-degree bounce wedge there for a while. So that would be in the very high bounce range when we're talking about the 60-degree. I'm talking about a 60-degree lob wedge. That'd be in the very high bounce range, and he could flop it up and catch it in his hand. So it's more to do with the technique and letting the club glide under the ball is what you're going to do for a flop shot. The only time you couldn't do that is if you're on hard pan and you're trying to hit a flop shot with a high bounce. But if you're on hard pan, I wouldn't ever recommend hitting a flop shot anyways, because it's just super dangerous, so easy to hit it thin. So those are my recommendations. Hope it helped you guys to clarify what type of bounce you need, what bounce is all about. And good luck to you guys. Go out and play some great golf, and I'll see y'all soon. All right, so we want to have a lot of birdies. I mean, everybody wants to birdie as much as possible. And the key to getting a lot of birdies is knocking it close with your wedges, getting into the range where you're going to need to use this sand wedge and this lob wedge. And a crucial piece of that is creating a lot of lag. So if you can create a lot of lag in your swing and let that lag release, then you're going to create a lot of club head speed. You're going to bomb it past your friends, and you're really going to have a good time playing golf. I want to get you guys started on that. That's one of the 5 keys to my scratch golf system. I got a video that's absolutely free of charge. It'll pop up a preview of that here in a second. If you want to watch that whole thing, just click on the link that pops up in your screen. If you're on a mobile device, click on the description or the iCard up above. You'll be able to watch that entire lag video free of charge. Start hitting it farther so you can get in that wedge range where you can knock it close, make a ton of birdies. So good luck to you guys, and I'll see y'all in the lag video. Hi guys, and welcome back. I'm Clay Ballard, and in today's video we're going to talk about one of the absolute worst drills for creating lag. It's a very common drill that I see, and in this drill what we're going to do is we're going to set the wrist very early to create an angle of lag, and then we're going to try to hold this throughout the swing. It's one of the worst things that you can do to build lag. I'm going to talk about the science behind why this is the case, and I'm also going to give you a great drill to help you improve your lag, all in this video. Let's go ahead and get started. If I do it this way versus holding that position, exact same thing happens when we're building lag in the golf swing. So what we want to do is throughout the swing, I want to have a very low and wide takeaway.
So I'm not going to set my wrist early at all. If you look at a lot of the top players, you look at Adam Scott, very wide takeaway, not very much wrist set at all. You look at Rory McIlroy, look at Tiger Woods. All these players are using a wide takeaway and not getting very much wrist set, so that later in the swing, as we start down, we can increase this wrist set, and we're really only going to max out this angle of lag for a split second in the downswing. Okay, so a 3-step drill here. Now, as we get started with this, I want to remind you that the fulcrum in this golf club for getting a massive amount of lag is right at the end of the golf club. This is where I want my hinge point to be. I want to use the full length of this club to build lag and then release lag.